In the quiet hum of the after-school hours, when most of the school had emptied out and the hallways echoed with a lonely sort of silence, there was one room that was never truly empty. Tucked away at the end of a long corridor, past the gymnasium and the art studio, was the music room. It wasn't a fancy room. The walls were a tired cream color, and the shelves were lined with sheet music that yellowed and curled at the edges. But in the center of it all, sitting like a regal black beast, was the grand piano. And for one quiet boy, that piano was everything. He wasn't a popular kid. He wasn't a star athlete or the class clown. In the crowded hallways between classes, he was almost invisible, a slim figure with his head down, moving through the sea of students like a ghost. He had a few friends, sure, but no one really knew him. No one knew about the world that lived inside his head, a world filled with melodies and harmonies that he couldn't express with words. But when he sat on the worn wooden bench in front of the piano, his fingers found the language he was born to speak. He would close his eyes, and the noise of the world, the teasing in the cafeteria, the pressure of grades, the feeling of being just another face in the crowd would all fade away. There was only him and the 88 keys. His music wasn't always perfect. Sometimes his fingers would slip or a chord would sound a little clumsy, but it was always honest. It was full of the feelings he kept locked away, the sadness he felt on rainy days, the quiet joy of a sunny morning, the frustration of a math problem he couldn't solve. The piano was his diary, his best friend, his sanctuary. The man who was supposed to be his guide in this world, his music teacher, saw things very differently. The teacher was a man who carried his own music like a heavy weight. He had dreamed of being a concert pianist, of playing in grand halls where people dressed up and listened in hushed reverence. He had practiced for thousands of hours, memorized sonatas and concertos, and even played a few small gigs in his younger days. But it never happened for him. He was good, very good, but he wasn't a genius. He didn't have that spark of pure, effortless magic that separates the very good from the truly great. So he took a job teaching high school music, telling himself it was a noble profession, that he was inspiring the next generation. But deep down, in a place he didn't like to admit existed, he was bitter. And watching this quiet boy play made that bitterness bubble up like a sour taste in his mouth. He would often stand in the doorway of the music room, unseen, and listen. He would hear the boy stumble through a complex piece by Chopin, then abandon the sheet music and play something of his own, something raw and beautiful and full of a passion that the teacher had lost long ago. It made him feel old. It made him feel like a failure. He saw the boy's talent not as a gift to be nurtured, but as a personal insult. It was a spotlight that shone on everything he had failed to become. So, instead of encouraging him, he found ways to chip away at his confidence. In class, he would ask the boy to play a simple scale for the other students, then make a comment like, "Technically okay, but there's no feeling. You're just hitting the notes." Music is about more than just the notes, you know? The other kids would snicker, and the boy's face would turn a shade of red as he mumbled, "Yes, sir." Another time, the boy was working on an improvisation, a flowing, emotional piece that seemed to come straight from his soul. The teacher walked by, tapped him on the shoulder, and said, "That's a bit of a mess, isn't it? It's all over the place. Stick to the sheet music. At least there, you know where you're supposed to go." Each comment was a small, sharp stone thrown at the boy's fragile confidence. He tried not to let it bother him. He tried to tell himself that the teacher was just a strict, old-fashioned man who believed in discipline. But it hurt. It made him doubt himself. He started to play a little quieter when the teacher was around. He started to feel a little shy about sharing the music. That came from inside him. The teacher's resentment wasn't just about the boy's talent. It was about his freedom. The boy played for the love of it, with no thought of fame or fortune. He played because he had to, because the music was inside him and it needed to get out. For the teacher, music had become a job, a reminder of a dream that had died. He saw the boy's joy, and it felt like a mockery of his own disappointment. He would look at the dusty old posters of famous composers on his classroom wall batch: Mozart, Beethoven and feel a pang of envy. They were immortal. They had created something that would last forever. He was just a teacher in a small town, growing older and more forgotten with each passing year. One afternoon, the teacher was tidying up his office when he found an old photograph of himself from his 20s. He was on a stage, smiling, his fingers poised above the keys of a piano. He looked so hopeful, so full of promise. He stared at the photograph for a long time, the smile on his own face fading. He remembered the feeling of being on that stage, the thrill of the performance, the dream of what could be. Then he thought of the quiet boy in the music room, playing with a talent that had been handed to him so easily. A dark, twisted thought began to form in the teacher's mind. It was a small thought at first, a little whisper of an idea. But as he sat there, surrounded by the ghosts of his own failed ambitions, the whisper grew louder. He looked at the boy's schedule, saw the upcoming informal class showcase he had planned, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He had a way to teach the boy a lesson, a way to show him that talent wasn't everything, a way to make him feel just as small and insignificant as the teacher felt every single day. And in that moment, a seed of a terrible idea began to sprout in the teacher's mind, watered by years of quiet resentment. The days that followed the teacher's dark realization were a strange mix of hope and hidden menace. The bitterness that had been simmering inside him for years finally found a purpose. It was no longer just a dull ache of regret. It was a sharp, focused tool he was ready to use. He decided the time was right to put his plan into motion. It started on a perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon, in the stuffy music room where the sound of flutes and clarinets usually filled the air with a chaotic kind of energy. The teacher clapped his hands, a gesture that usually meant the class was over, but this time it meant he had something to say. He leaned against his desk, a friendly, almost fatherly smile on his face that none of his students had seen before. "All right, everyone, settle down," he began, his voice smoother than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about your futures, about how performing in front of people can be, well, terrifying. But it's also a skill you need. So we're going to do something a little different. We're going to have an informal class showcase. Nothing major. No parents, no judges. Just us. A safe space to get your feet wet." A few of the students groaned, already imagining the embarrassment of playing a squeaky note in front of their friends. But for the quiet boy in the back, a jolt went through him. A showcase. The word hung in the air, both scary and exciting. He had never played for an audience before, not a real one. The idea made his hands feel sweaty, but it also sparked a tiny flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. The teacher watched the faces in the room, his eyes searching until they found the boy. He saw the mix of fear and interest there, and he knew his hook was baited. After class, as the other students were packing up their instruments and chattering about their weekend plans, the teacher called out, "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" The boy flinched, worried he was in trouble for something. He walked cautiously to the teacher's desk, his head slightly bowed. But the teacher's tone was completely different from his usual critical one. It was warm, almost conspiratorial. "I wanted to talk to you privately about this showcase," the teacher said, leaning forward and lowering his voice. "I see a real spark in you. A raw talent that most of these kids, well, they just don't have it. This isn't just about getting over stage fright for you. This is an opportunity. Colleges, especially good music programs, they look for this kind of thing. You need a portfolio. You need to show them you're not just another kid who can play a few tunes." He paused, letting the words sink in. The boy looked up, his eyes wide. No one had ever spoken to him like this before. No one had ever seen him as someone who could go to college for music, someone who was special. "I want you to prepare your most ambitious piece," the teacher continued, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. It felt heavy, but also strangely reassuring. Something that shows them everything you can do. Don't hold back. I believe in you. The boy was speechless. He could only manage a small, shaky nod. A rare glimmer of official recognition felt like the sun breaking through the clouds in the days that followed. The boy was a person transformed. The dusty music room was no longer just his escape. It was his workshop. He spent every free moment there, his fingers flying across the keys with a new sense of purpose. He chose a piece he had always loved but was too afraid to try, a complex and emotional sonata that told a story of struggle and victory. He poured all his energy into it, all his newfound hope. He would stay late after school, the setting sun casting long shadows across the room, and play until his fingers ached. He even started humming the melody in the hallways, a small, unconscious smile on his face. For the first time, he wasn't just playing for himself. He was playing for the future the teacher had shown him. He felt like he was finally being seen, but while the boy was building his dreams, the teacher was laying his trap. He was a master of subtlety, and he knew exactly which students to approach. He waited until a few of the more popular, cynical kids were lingering after class one day. There was a girl with a sharp, cutting laugh and a boy who was always messing with his phone, looking bored with the world. The teacher casually wandered over, trying to look like he was just tidying up. For this showcase, our quiet friend is planning something pretty big, he said, keeping his tone light and gossipy. The girl looked up, intrigued. He thinks he's a real prodigy, the teacher continued with a little chuckle. He's going to play this huge, dramatic piece. It could be a little much. It might be funny if he got a little reality check, just to bring him back down to earth. He didn't have to say much more. He saw the spark of mischief in their eyes. He framed it as a harmless prank, a bit of fun to break up the monotony of school. Just play along, he whispered. If he gets too serious, maybe a few laughs. A little heckling. Nothing mean. Just a joke. The students grinned, eager for the drama. They loved the idea of being in on a secret, of having a little power. They didn't see the cruelty in the teacher's plan. They just saw an opportunity to be the cool kids, the ones in the know. The days leading up to the showcase were a strange dance of innocence and deceit. The boy would walk through the hallways, his mind filled with arpeggios and crescendos, his heart thumping with a mixture of terror and excitement. A few feet behind him, the teacher's chosen accomplices would whisper and snicker, watching him. They would look at each other and roll their eyes, sharing the secret of the joke they were about to play. The boy, lost in his world of music and hope, didn't notice a thing. He was too busy finally feeling good about himself, too busy believing that for once a teacher was on his side. The teacher would watch from a distance, a satisfied smirk on his face, as his two worlds moved closer to the collision he had so carefully engineered. The stage was set, the script was written, and the main actor was walking right into the trap, humming a tune of triumph that was about to be cruelly silenced. The day of the showcase arrived with a strange, heavy stillness in the air. For the quiet boy, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. He woke up that morning with a flutter in his stomach, a nervous energy that made it hard to eat his toast. Every bite felt dry and tasteless. He picked out his clothes with unusual care, choosing a clean shirt and his nicest jeans, wanting to look the part even though he was just playing for his classmates. The walk to school was different too. The familiar streets seemed to be watching him, the morning sun feeling less like a gentle greeting and more like a harsh spotlight. He kept running through the first few bars of his sonata in his head, his fingers twitching at his sides, playing invisible keys on his thighs. He was ready. He had practiced until his fingers were sore, until the music was a part of him. But the fear was a cold knot in his stomach. A reminder that playing for himself in an empty room was a world away from playing for a room, full of his peers, when he got to the music room. The usual chaos was replaced by an eerie order. The chairs, usually scattered randomly, were lined up in neat rows facing the grand piano like a tiny, makeshift concert hall. The black beast of a piano looked even more imposing than usual, its polished surface reflecting the nervous faces of the students filing in. The boy could feel a strange tension in the room, a kind of electric current that made the hair on his arms stand up. He saw the girl with the sharp laugh and the boy who was always on his phone huddled together near the front row. They kept glancing over at him and whispering, smirking to themselves. He tried to ignore it, telling himself he was just being paranoid. High school was always like this, a web of whispers and inside jokes he was never a part of. He found a seat in the back, wanting to be invisible for just a little while longer, and watch the other students perform. A shy girl played a hesitant tune on her flute, her face beet red. A lanky boy stumbled through a song on his acoustic guitar, forgetting the chords and starting over twice. The small audience was polite, clapping softly after each performance. But the boy could feel the undercurrent of restlessness, the teenage boredom that was just waiting for something more interesting to happen. Then, the teacher stood up to take control of the room. He was the picture of a supportive mentor. He smiled warmly at the shy flute player, telling her, "Beautiful tone, just beautiful. Don't be so nervous, you have a real gift." He clapped the guitar player on the back, saying, "Hey, keeping going is what matters." That's the spirit of music. He moved around the room with an easy confidence, his voice calm and encouraging. He made a little speech about how important it was to be a good audience, to support each other, and to remember that everyone was there to learn and grow. "This is a safe space," he said, his eyes sweeping over the room and lingering for a fraction of a second on the front row where his chosen accomplices sat. "A space for courage. Let's show some respect for the courage it takes to get up there and play." The irony of his words was lost on everyone but him. The boy in the back row listened and felt a surge of gratitude. The teacher was right. It did take courage, and for a moment the knot in his stomach loosened. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he was in a safe place after all. Finally, the teacher looked at his clipboard and said the words the boy had been both dreading and anticipating. "And now, to close out our showcase, we have a very special performance." He looked up, his eyes finding the boy in the back. "He's been working incredibly hard on a very ambitious piece. Let's give a big welcome to our next performer." A smattering of applause followed, a bit more energetic than before. The boy's heart started to pound against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in his chest. This was it. He stood up, his legs feeling a little wobbly, and began the long walk to the front of the room. With every step, he could feel the eyes of the entire class on him. The whispers seemed to stop, and all he could hear was the squeak of his sneakers on the linoleum floor. He saw the girl with the sharp laugh give him a wide, predatory grin. He saw the boy on his phone look up, a bored, cruel smirk playing on his lips. He reached the piano and sat down on the worn wooden bench. It felt familiar and comforting under him. He placed his fingers on the cool, smooth keys, a small smile touching his lips. This was his world. He could do this. He took a deep breath, just as he had practiced, and reached for the sheet music that the teacher had thoughtfully placed on the stand for him. He wanted to make a good impression, to show the teacher that his faith in him hadn't been misplaced. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the page for the first note of his sonata. But it wasn't there. The page was filled with big, colorful notes and silly cartoons of smiling animals. It was a child's piano primer open to the simplest, most ridiculous song of all, Chopsticks. For a second, his brain just refused to process it. He blinked, sure his eyes were playing tricks on him. He flipped to the next page. More cartoons, more simple songs? This wasn't his music. It was a joke. A stupid, childish joke. A small snicker erupted from the front row. It was the girl with the sharp laugh. She quickly covered her mouth, but her eyes were dancing with malicious glee. That single snicker was like a spark in a dry forest. Another student joined in, then another. The laughter wasn't loud, not at first. It was a series of giggles and snorts, but it was growing, spreading through the room like a virus. The boy's face began to burn with a heat so intense it felt like his skin was on fire. He could feel the blood rushing to his cheeks, his neck, his ears. He was frozen, his hands hovering over the ridiculous sheet music, the laughter washing over him in waves. It was the sound of humiliation. It was the sound of every insecurity he had ever had being made real. His head snapped up, his eyes searching the room for an explanation. For a friendly face, for anyone who could tell him what was going on. His gaze landed on the teacher, who was standing by the door with a look of perfect, practiced confusion on his face. He shrugged as if to say, "Oh dear, what a silly mix-up." But as the boy looked into his eyes, he saw it. It was just a flicker, a tiny glimmer behind the mask of innocence. It wasn't confusion. It was satisfaction. It was triumph. And in that horrible, heart-stopping moment, the boy understood. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a mix-up. It was a setup. The teacher's encouraging words, his hand on his shoulder, his talk of colleges and portfolios, it was all part of a cruel, elaborate prank. The laughter in the room grew louder, the students no longer trying to hide it. They were pointing at him, at the silly music on the stand, at the red-faced fool sitting at the grand piano. The world seemed to shrink to the size of this small, terrible room, and the sound of their laughter was the only thing that was real. He was trapped, exposed, and utterly alone. The shame was a physical weight, crushing him, stealing the air from his lungs. He had been so careful, so hopeful, and he had walked right into the trap. For a long, terrible moment, the boy was a statue. The laughter was a physical force pushing against him, trying to knock him over. It was the sound of every nightmare he'd ever had about being seen, about being noticed for all the wrong reasons. His face felt like it was melting, the shame so hot and intense it was blinding. He could feel a tremor starting in his hands, a pathetic shake that he was sure everyone could see. He wanted to disappear. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He wanted to run out of the room and never come back. The urge to flee was so strong it was like a current pulling at his legs, begging him to just get up and go. But he was frozen, glued to the bench, trapped under the weight of 100 mocking eyes. His gaze darted around the room. A desperate search for an escape route, but all he saw were faces twisted with amusement. The girl with the sharp laugh was wiping a tear from her eye, not from sadness, but from the sheer joy of his humiliation. The boy on his phone wasn't even looking at his phone anymore. He was recording, a cruel smile plastered on his face as he captured the boy's shame for posterity. Then his eyes found the teacher again. The man was still standing by the door, his arms crossed. The look of confusion was gone, replaced by a thin, tight-lipped smile of satisfaction. He was enjoying this. He had orchestrated this entire symphony of embarrassment, and he was savoring every note. And in that instant, something inside the boy shifted. It was like a switch being flipped. The hot, blinding shame in his chest was suddenly extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard, and incredibly clear feeling. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something purer, something stronger. It was resolve. He was not going to run. He was not going to cry. He was not going to give them the satisfaction. Slowly, deliberately, the boy moved. His hands, which had been hovering over the ridiculous cartoon-filled book, moved with a new purpose. He reached out and closed the folder. The soft thud it made was shockingly loud in the room, cutting through the fading laughter like a knife. Then, with a calm, steady push, he slid the book off the music stand. It slid across the polished surface of the piano and fell to the floor with a gentle slap. The gesture was small, but it was monumental. It was him rejecting their joke. It was him saying, "No, this is not my story. This is not my music." A new hush fell over the room. The laughter had completely died, replaced by a confused murmur. What was he doing? The hecklers in the front row looked at each other, their smirks faltering. This wasn't part of the plan. The plan was for him to crumble, to run away crying. This quiet defiance was unnerving. The boy didn't look at any of them. He just looked down at the keys, at the familiar black and white landscape that was his true home. He rested his fingers on them, feeling the cool ivory and smooth ebony under his fingertips. He closed his eyes. He took a deep, slow breath, and as he let it out, the entire world, the teacher, the students, the humiliation, the fear, it all just faded away. There was only him and the piano, and then he began to play. It wasn't his sonata. It wasn't anything anyone had ever heard before. It was raw, it was loud, and it was angry. The first notes were like shards of glass, sharp and discordant. His fingers hammered at the keys, not with sloppy rage, but with a fierce, controlled power. The music was a storm, a torrent of frustration and hurt that had been building up for years. It was the sound of every backhanded comment, every dismissive glance, every moment of feeling invisible and then suddenly horribly visible. The notes tumbled over each other, a chaotic cascade of minor keys that filled the room with a tension so thick you could feel it. The students in the front row physically recoiled, their confident smirks replaced by wide-eyed shock. The boy who had been recording slowly lowered his phone, his mouth hanging open. They had come to laugh at a joke, but this was no joke. This was real. Then, just as the storm of anger felt like it might tear the room apart, the music began to change. The chaotic crashing of notes softened, settling into a deep, melancholic melody. It was a sound of profound sadness, but it wasn't weak. It was the sadness of someone who had been hurt but was not broken. It was a lament, a beautiful, heart-wrenching cry that spoke of loneliness and misunderstanding. A girl in the third row, who had been whispering to her friend, went completely silent, her eyes fixed on the boy at the piano. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the music touching a place in them they didn't know existed. They were no longer thinking about the prank. They were just feeling the music, and it was powerful. The teacher's face had gone from satisfied to confused, and now to pale. He stood frozen by the door, his arms uncrossed and hanging limply at his sides. This was impossible. This was not the shy, clumsy boy he knew. This was someone else entirely. He had tried to expose the boy as a fraud, a talentless kid who thought he was special. But the music pouring from the piano was the most honest, most special thing anyone in that room had ever heard. His plan was not just failing. It was exploding in his face, creating the very legend he had tried to destroy. As the sad melody reached its peak, it began to transform again. A new thread of sound wove its way into the music, a hopeful, rising arpeggio that climbed higher and higher, pushing back against the sadness. It was a sound of defiance, of strength. The boy's posture changed too. His back straightened, his shoulders squared. He was no longer hunched over the keys in shame. He was commanding them. The music swelled, growing in complexity and confidence. It was a story being told in real time, a story of pain but also of survival. It was the story of a boy who had been pushed down, but was now standing up, taller and stronger than before. The final minutes of the piece were a soaring, triumphant anthem. It was loud and bold and full of a joy that was not naive but hard-won. It filled every corner of the room, washing over the stunned students, silencing them completely. They were no longer an audience of mocking teenagers. They were witnesses to a miracle. The boy was no longer the victim of a cruel prank. He was the master of the moment, a king on his throne of black and white keys, and his music was his victory speech. The final note of the boy's improvised masterpiece hung in the air of the music room, shimmering and alive. It was a sound so full of triumph and strength that it seemed to absorb all the oxygen in the room. For what felt like an eternity, there was a profound and absolute silence. No one moved, no one breathed. The students who had been laughing were now frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. The girl with the sharp laugh had her hand over her mouth, but this time it wasn't to hide a smirk. It was to hide her astonishment. The boy who had been recording had let his phone slip from his grasp, and it now lay forgotten on the floor. The entire room was held captive by the echo of a song that had been born from pain and had blossomed into a victory. The boy at the piano was the first to break the spell. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his chest rising and falling as if he had just run a marathon. His fingers, which had danced across the keys with such fury and grace, now rested still, the tips trembling slightly from the exertion. He slowly opened his eyes, and for a moment he seemed to see the room as if for the first time. He saw the faces not as a mocking crowd, but as individuals, each one touched by the music he had created. He saw the shy flute player in the third row, her eyes glistening with tears. He saw a couple of the jocks from the back of the class, who usually looked bored with everything, leaning forward in their seats, their expressions full of genuine respect. Then it started. It wasn't a wave of applause, but a single clap. It came from the shy girl who had played the flute. It was a soft, hesitant sound, but in the silence it was as loud as a gunshot, Another person joined in, then another. Within seconds, the quiet clapping grew into a roar. It wasn't the polite, obligatory applause they had given the other performers. This was different. This was a thunderous, deafening, spontaneous explosion of sound. Students were on their feet, stomping and cheering, their faces flushed with excitement. They were not just clapping for a performance. They were cheering for a moment of pure, unfiltered truth they had just witnessed. They were cheering for the quiet boy who had refused to be broken. The boy himself looked stunned. He stared at the standing ovation, his eyes wide with disbelief. This was not what he had expected. He hadn't played for applause. He had played to survive, to turn the poison of their mockery into something beautiful and strong. He gave a small, awkward nod, a flicker of a smile touching his lips before he quickly looked down at the keys, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. But while the boy was experiencing a moment of triumph, the man who had set the stage for his humiliation was experiencing his own personal nightmare. The teacher stood by the door, his face ashen. The confident smirk had been wiped away, replaced by a mask of pure panic. He had wanted to teach the boy a lesson, to knock him down a peg, to prove that his own bitterness was more powerful than the boy's talent. But his plan had failed in the most spectacular way possible. He hadn't exposed a fraud. He had unleashed a genius. He hadn't humiliated the boy. He had given him the platform to become a legend. The thunderous applause was not for him. It was a judgment against him. He saw the principal standing in the hallway, drawn by the powerful music and the ensuing noise. The principal's face was stern, his eyes moving from the cheering students to the pale, terrified teacher. In that moment, the teacher knew. It was over. In the days that followed, the story of the showcase spread through the school like wildfire. It became the only thing anyone was talking about. But the narrative quickly changed. The whispers in the hallways were no longer about a boy being pranked. They were about the incredible song he had played in response. The boy who had once been invisible was now a figure of quiet reverence. Students he didn't know would smile at him in the corridors. Teachers would stop him in the hallway to ask if he was okay and to tell him how proud they were. He was no longer a ghost. He was a story. The truth about the teacher's cruel prank also began to surface. It started with the girl who had been in on the joke. The awe she felt during the performance had curdled into a deep, gnawing guilt. She couldn't sleep, seeing the boy's humiliated face in her mind, followed by the image of his powerful, defiant performance. She finally broke down and told her parents everything. Other students who had been primed for the prank, feeling the same mix of shame and admiration, began to talk. They spoke to other teachers, to the school counselor. The pieces of the teacher's malicious puzzle came together, and a clear picture of his calculated cruelty emerged. The school administration moved quickly. There were quiet meetings behind closed doors. The principal spoke to the boy, who, with his characteristic humility, downplayed the teacher's role, simply saying he made a mistake. But the evidence from other students was overwhelming. The teacher was confronted with the accounts of his scheme. Faced with the loss of his job and his reputation, he chose to resign rather than face a formal dismissal. His exit from the school was quiet and shameful, a stark contrast to the grand, humiliating exit he had planned for the boy. He packed up his office in the middle of a school day, when most students were in class, and slipped away. A defeated man whose own bitterness had finally consumed him. The boy's life had changed forever. The experience had forged a new kind of strength in him. He still spent his afternoons in the music room, but something was different. He played with a new confidence, a new understanding of the power his music held. He started a small music club, inviting other students to come and jam with him after school, creating a space that was the exact opposite of the one his former teacher had created. It was a space of encouragement, collaboration, and joy. He was still a quiet person, but he was no longer invisible. He had found his voice, and it was a voice that spoke through the keys of the piano, turning pain into beauty and cruelty into a song that would be remembered in the hallways of that school for years to come. The teacher's prank had been meant to be an ending, but for the boy it had become a beginning. He had taken the worst moment of his life and turned it into his defining victory. And the echo of that single powerful song continued to resonate long after the laughter had faded away.